My wife missed our 25th anniversary dinner because of a conference in Phoenix. I found out she was never in Phoenix when I checked the hotel rewards app on our shared tablet and saw a check-in notification from the Meridian Grand, 14 miles from our house. That was a Thursday. By Friday morning, I had already called my attorney. My name is Gordon Aldrich. I'm 52 years old. I run a structural engineering firm out of Charlotte, North Carolina, 19 employees, 2 junior partners, and more concrete and rebar calculations under this city's skyline than most people think about when they're walking through it. I started the firm in a one-room office above a sandwich shop when I was 31, with a used drafting table and a laptop that overheated if you ran more than 2 programs at once. I built it the same way I build everything. Slowly, carefully, accounting for every load-bearing variable before I commit the design to paper. I married my wife when we were both 27. We met at a firm dinner, the kind of networking event you attend because you're supposed to, not because you want to. She was a project coordinator for a commercial developer at the time. Sharp, organized, funny in a dry, sideways way that I didn't expect. We dated for 2 years. Got married in a small ceremony in Asheville that her mother cried through and my father called sensible, which from him was the highest available praise. We had one son, Donovan, who's 22 now, and finishing his master's in urban planning at Georgia Tech. Good kid, steady in the way that some people are steady. Not because nothing bothers them, but because they've learned how to carry what bothers them without letting it show. For 25 years, I thought we had something real. Not the kind of marriage people write songs about, but the kind that holds. The kind where you know how the other person takes their coffee and what they sound like when they're actually laughing, versus when they're performing a laugh for company. And where you've had the same argument enough times that it doesn't scare you anymore because you both know how it ends. I stopped paying attention to the signs. That's the honest version. Our anniversary falls on the second Saturday of September. I made the reservation at Linwood House 6 weeks out. It's a restaurant in an old converted mill on the edge of Dilworth. The kind of place with exposed brick and a wine list that's 1 page too long, and food that justifies the price. We'd been there twice before, once for her 40th birthday, and once when I closed the firm's biggest contract to date. It felt like the right place for 25 years. She told me about the Phoenix conference in August, a 3-day workshop for project managers. Her firm was sending 4 people. She'd been selected. She seemed genuinely pleased about it. I had no reason to question it. She traveled for work 4 or 5 times a year. I knew her colleagues, knew the firm, knew the rhythm of those trips. The date landed on our anniversary weekend, which she apologized for, said she tried to get out of it, said we'd celebrate the following weekend instead. I told her it was fine. It wasn't fine, but I told her it was. The Saturday of our anniversary, I had planned to spend at the office catching up on a permit review that had been sitting on my desk for 2 weeks. I came home around 5, changed, thought about ordering food, decided against it. I made a sandwich instead and sat at the kitchen island with a glass of bourbon in the quiet of a house that felt specifically empty. I picked up the shared tablet to check the weather. We kept it on the kitchen counter. It was one of those household devices, grocery lists, recipe lookups, nothing important. The hotel rewards app we use for travel points was logged into the family account. A notification had come through earlier that afternoon and I hadn't seen it because I'd been at the office. It read, "Check-in confirmed. Meridian Grand, Charlotte. Points applied to your account." I set down the bourbon. The Meridian Grand is on South Tryon Street. I know the building. I've walked past it 100 times. It is 14 miles from our house and approximately 4,000 miles from Phoenix, Arizona. I sat with that for about 3 minutes. Then I picked up my phone and opened her contact and typed, "Hope the conference is going well." "What's the hotel like?" she responded 11 minutes later. "Small but fine. Good AC at least. Miss you." I read that message twice. I read it a 3rd time. Then I put the phone face down on the counter, finished the bourbon, rinsed the glass, and went to bed. I didn't sleep, but I went to bed. I didn't sleep, but I went to bed. The name on the rewards check-in was listed under the joint account, which meant the room had been booked using our travel points. Points we'd accumulated together over 25 years of flights and hotels and work trips. She'd used our shared currency to pay for something she needed me not to know about. I thought about that for a long time in the dark. Sunday morning she came home. She walked in through the garage door with a rolling carry-on and the particular bright energy of a person who has recently been somewhere they enjoyed. She hugged me in the kitchen, said the conference was useful, asked if I'd eaten well while she was gone. I said yes. I asked about the hotel. She said small, but the bed was comfortable. I nodded. I said nothing else. That afternoon, I drove to the office, pulled up the shared rewards account on my computer, and went through the full transaction history going back 18 months. 3 hotel check-ins in Charlotte on dates that corresponded to her supposed out-of-town trips. 2 of them at the Meridian Grand. 1 at the Halston on Moorhead Street. Restaurant charges at places we'd never been to together. A spa booking in March when she'd told me she was at a site visit in Raleigh. The picture that came together was not the picture of a 3-day conference in Phoenix. I closed the laptop. I sat in my office chair and looked out the window at the skyline I'd spent 20 years helping build. And I thought about load-bearing walls. About the difference between a crack in the plaster and a crack in the foundation. One you patch, one you don't. Monday morning, I called Warren Chu. Warren is 61, runs a family law practice on Providence Road, and has the kind of quiet, methodical precision that I respect in both engineers and attorneys. He'd handled my firm's partnership agreements twice. He told me once, over coffee after a Chamber of Commerce event, that the most expensive mistake a person can make in a marriage is to be the one who didn't plan for failure. I'd remembered that. I wasn't entirely surprised to find myself sitting across from him now. He listened to everything: the rewards notification, the transaction history, the 18 months of discrepancies. I had printed the records before I left the office. He read through them without comment. When he got to the top of the second page, he set the papers down and folded his hands on the desk. "Tell me about the prenuptial agreement," he said. We had signed one. 14 years into our marriage, during the period when the firm was expanding rapidly and I was restructuring assets and adding junior partners. My attorney at the time had recommended formalizing the arrangement. My wife had called it unnecessary but signed it without much argument. Her attorney had reviewed it. Everything had been done correctly. Warren read through it now with the attention of a man who was looking for specific language. When he found the infidelity clause, he nodded once, slowly, and set it down. "This is well drafted," he said. "The business assets are protected. The equity in the firm is premarital or post-prenup formation, both of which fall outside the marital estate under this agreement." He looked at me directly. "How do you want to handle this?" "Quietly," I said. "No confrontation, no drama. Asset separation first, then the filing." He nodded. "I'll start the paperwork this week." I drove home through afternoon traffic, thinking about the spa booking in March. She'd come home from that Raleigh trip relaxed in a way I'd noticed and attributed to the time away. I'd been glad she'd had a break. I'd asked if the site visit went smoothly, and she'd said yes, and I'd made dinner, and we'd eaten together and watched television, and I had believed, completely and without any particular effort, every word of it. That's the part that sits in your chest, not the anger, the inventory of every time you accepted an explanation, because it was easier than the alternative. I separated the household savings account on Wednesday. I had my own business accounts that predated the marriage, kept at a separate institution entirely, and I had never merged them because my then attorney had advised against it during the firm's early formation, and I'd seen no reason to change the arrangement. The joint accounts at Summit Financial were a different matter. I met with the branch manager, a careful and professional woman, who asked exactly the right questions and no others, and transferred my portion to a new individual account without incident. I also made a call to the insurance company that carried the policy on her company car. The car was a leased vehicle registered under Aldrich Structural Group, LLC. Her name appeared nowhere on the documentation. I'd arranged the lease as a business asset 6 years prior when she'd started doing coordination work that involved site visits, and the arrangement had been convenient enough that we'd never formalized the personal use portion. I informed the fleet contact that I would be terminating the arrangement at the end of the current billing cycle. These are the kinds of things you can do very quietly when you've spent 20 years keeping organized records. She didn't know any of it yet. She went to work each morning, came home each evening, asked about my day, made plans for the weekend. I answered her questions. I made plans for nothing. On Thursday evening, Donovan called. He was between classes, calling from a coffee shop, his voice carrying the ambient noise of other people's conversations in the background. He asked how I was. I told him I was fine. He asked about the anniversary, what we'd ended up doing to celebrate. I said we'd keep it simple. There was a pause on his end. Donovan is like me in the particular way that he doesn't fill silences. He sits in them and decides what they mean before he responds. "Dad," he said carefully. "Is everything okay?" I thought about lying. I'm good at it when I need to be, in the same way I'm good at anything that requires patience and a steady surface. But Donovan was 22 years old, and he'd been raised in a house where his questions got honest answers. "Not completely," I said. I'm handling some things. I'll tell you more when there's more to tell. Another pause. Do you need me to come home? No, I said. Stay in Atlanta. Keep your focus on the thesis review. That's what I need from you right now. He asked 2 more questions, both careful, both the right questions. I answered what I could, and told him the truth about what I couldn't, which was that I didn't have all the facts lined up yet, and I wasn't going to hand him noise before I had something solid. Okay, he said finally. But call me. I will, I said. After I hung up, I sat at the kitchen table for a while. The house was quiet. She was in the other room watching something on television. I could hear the low murmur of it through the wall, that ordinary, completely ordinary sound of an evening at home, and I thought about how the surface of things can be entirely intact while the structure underneath has been compromised for longer than you knew. The conversation I had not been prepared for came from her father. He called me on a Tuesday afternoon. I was between site visits, parked in a lot outside a coffee shop in Ballantyne, reviewing a material schedule on my phone. His name on the screen stopped me. He is 74, retired from a 28-year career in commercial insurance underwriting. A man of measured sentences and careful assessments, the kind of man who tells you exactly what he thinks without dressing it up as anything else. We'd gotten along from the beginning. He told me once, about a year after the wedding, that his daughter had a gift for identifying quality in other people and a tendency to undervalue it once she had it. I'd taken that as an observation, not a warning. I probably should have taken it as both. I answered. Gordon, he said. His voice was the same as always. Level, unhurried. I've been sitting on a phone call for 3 days trying to decide if I should make it. I'm glad you did, I said. She called me. A pause. Not to confess. To vent. She seems to have sensed that something has shifted and she wanted to hear that she was going to be fine. His voice roughed slightly at the edges. I didn't tell her that. I waited. I want you to know something, he said, and I'm telling you this as a man who has known my daughter for 49 years and watched her make choices that I didn't always understand. What you built for this family, the firm, the house, the way you raised that boy, the 25 years you showed up for, that was real, and she knew it was real. She just convinced herself that keeping it and doing what she was doing were 2 separate decisions. He stopped. They weren't. I was quiet for a moment. There's a particular weight to hearing a thing confirmed by someone who has no reason to confirm it, except that they believe it's true. I appreciate that, I said. I'm not done, he said. I also want to tell you that I should have called you 6 months ago. There were things I noticed at Easter, things that didn't add up, and I told myself it wasn't my place. A long pause. A man who treated my daughter the way you did deserved better than my silence. I'm sorry for that. We talked for another 15 minutes. Not about the marriage, not about what came next. Just 2 men talking in the particular way that men talk when they're dealing with something painful, and they both decided not to perform about it. He asked about Donovan. I told him about the thesis. He told me about a fishing trip he'd been planning. Before he hung up, he said, "You'll come out the other side of this with your house in order. I'd bet on it." I drove to my next visit and spent the afternoon checking structural specifications on a 6-story mixed-use building going up in Noda. Normal work. Necessary calculations. The weight in my chest was still there, but it had the quality of something I knew how to carry. Warren filed the formal discovery request on a Monday. That same week, I arranged for the company car to be collected from the parking structure of her office building. I'd coordinated with the fleet manager to have a driver and transport vehicle there at 2 dials on a Wednesday afternoon. Her key fob was on file with building security, which I had arranged to have left at the front desk. The car was gone by 3:30. No conversation, no confrontation. Just a vehicle that had been a corporate asset returning to the corporate account. She called me at 4545. I let it go to voicemail. She called again at 5002. I listened to that one. Her voice moved through several registers in the space of about 45 seconds. Disbelief first, then a sharper edge, then the particular tone of someone who has just understood that a boundary they thought was negotiable was not. She used the phrase, "You can't just do this twice." She said the word unfair once. She did not, I noticed, say anything about the reasons this had happened. I deleted the voicemail and returned to the bid estimate I'd been working on, a full HVAC and structural retrofit on a warehouse complex in Concord. The numbers were close, but the margins were there. The following evening, she confronted me directly. She came into the study while I was at my desk, stood in the doorway in a way that meant she'd been building up to this, and said my name the way you say a name when you want someone's full attention. I turned around and gave it to her. I know something is happening, she said. I know you're doing something. I want to know what you know and when you knew it and why you haven't said anything. I looked at her for a moment. She was still the woman I'd married, and that fact no longer moved me the way it once would have. The Meridian Grand, I said. September 12th, the same day you were at a conference in Phoenix. The color that left her face was immediate and complete. I went back 14 months in the rewards account, I continued, keeping my voice level. 3 Charlotte hotels, the spa in March, the restaurant charges. I paused. You were careful, not careful enough. She sat down on the edge of the reading chair near the window. Her hands were in her lap and she was looking at the floor between us with the expression of someone doing rapid calculations. I can't explain, she started. You probably can, I said. But I don't need you to. I've already spoken with Warren. The filing is underway. She looked up. You've already filed? The process is underway, I said. The prenuptial agreement is intact. The business assets are protected. I'm not interested in a long contested process. I've instructed Warren to keep this as straightforward as possible. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that I could hear the neighbor's dog outside and the sound of a car passing on the street. 25 years, she said finally. Not an argument, more like a person arriving at the full weight of a number they'd been avoiding. Yes, I said, and you're just done. I've been done since September 12th, I said. I've just been orderly about it. She didn't answer that. She stood up after a moment and left the room, and I heard her walk down the hallway and into the bedroom and close the door. Not a slam, just a door closing. I turned back to my desk and worked until 11. Donovan came home the following weekend. I hadn't asked him to. He showed up Friday evening with a backpack and the quiet intention of someone who had made a decision and wasn't going to announce it as a decision. He sat with me at the kitchen table for 3 hours that night. I told him everything. The hotel notification, the transaction records, the conversation with Warren, the conversation with his grandfather. I gave him facts. I didn't editorialize. I let him arrive at his own conclusions at his own pace. He was quiet through most of it. When I finished, he was looking at the table with his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. Were you surprised? He asked finally. I thought about that honestly. By the fact of it, no. By the fact of it, no. By how long it had been going on? Yes. He nodded slowly. How are you actually doing? I'm functioning well, I said, which is the truest answer I have. He stayed the weekend. On Saturday, he sat with his mother for 2 hours in the living room while I was at the office. I don't know everything that was said. When I came home, he was in the kitchen making dinner. Something he'd learned to cook in college that involved a cast iron pan and more garlic than was strictly necessary. And when I walked in, he looked up and said, "She's not wrong that she loves you. For whatever that's worth now." It's worth something, I said. Yeah, he said. I thought so. He drove back to Atlanta Sunday afternoon. Before he left, he stood in the driveway in the autumn light and said, "You did everything right, you know? The reservation, the wine, the whole thing." He paused. She just wasn't paying attention to what she had. I told him that meant more than he knew. Because it did. The formal process took 4 months. Warren was thorough and mercifully efficient. The prenuptial agreement held on every point. The firm, incorporated 3 years before our marriage, and held under a business trust structure that had never been commingled with marital assets, was never in question. The house went to mediation and settled without court intervention. She retained her personal accounts, her vehicle, which she purchased separately, and the furniture she'd chosen for the living room over a period of years. She moved to Raleigh in February. Her firm had an office there, and she'd arranged a transfer. Closer to colleagues, she said, a fresh start. I wished her no harm. I also made no effort to smooth the path. There was one conversation, 2 weeks before the final decree, that I hadn't anticipated. Her brother called me, not to advocate for her, not to argue about the settlement. He called to tell me something. He said he'd seen her with someone at a Hornets game in November, over a year ago. Said he thought he was misreading it, told himself it was a work colleague, convinced himself for 14 months that it wasn't what it looked like. He said he'd been wrong to do that. He said he was sorry. I listened to the whole thing. At the end, I said, "I appreciate you calling." He said, "I should have called 14 months ago. I know that." "You called now," I said. "That counts." I meant it. Not because 14 months didn't matter, but because a person who owns a mistake without excuses deserves to be heard. We talked for another 10 minutes, about nothing important. The kind of ordinary conversation that happens between two men who have always gotten along and are now figuring out what that means without the marriage in the middle of it. I thought about what he'd said for a long time after we hung up. The decree came through on a Friday in March. Warren called me at 10 in the morning to confirm. I thanked him, put the phone down, and spent the rest of the morning reviewing structural calculations for a parking deck project in Uptown that my junior partner had been managing. Normal work, the kind that requires your full attention and gives you nothing to do with your mind except the problem in front of you. That evening, Donovan called. He'd been tracking the timeline. He asked how I was. I told him the truth, which was that I felt lighter than I'd expected and quieter than I'd expected, and that I wasn't sure yet what to do with either of those things. That sounds right, actually, he said. We talked for an hour. At the end, he said, I want to come up for your birthday this year. Actually, come up. Book the flights and all of it. You don't have to do that, I said. I know, he said. That's why I'm doing it. My birthday falls in late April. He flew in on a Thursday evening and we had dinner at a restaurant in South End that I'd been meaning to try. The kind of place with no reservations and a long wait and food that makes the wait feel reasonable. We sat at a bar table because there were no other options and drank good bourbon and ate things off a menu that changed weekly. And he told me about the thesis. And I told him about the parking deck. And we argued good-naturedly about a Hornets trade from earlier in the season that I thought was smart and he thought was inexplicable. It was an ordinary dinner. It was the best evening I'd had in longer than I wanted to calculate. On the walk back to the car, he said, without looking at me, Grandpa told me you reminded him of himself when he was your age. Said you both know how to hold a line. I thought about that. High praise from him, I said. Highest available, Donovan said. And he smiled, the sideways, private smile that he'd had since he was about 7 years old. We drove home with the windows down and the radio on low, the city going past in its ordinary nighttime way, traffic and lit windows and all the unremarkable architecture of an ordinary evening. I parked in the driveway and cut the engine and sat for a moment. 52 years old, firm solid, kid, good, house mime, the spring air coming through the open window, indifferent and clean. That was the whole inventory. And it was exactly enough to build from. I've thought about the moment I set down that bourbon a lot since then. The tablet on the counter, the notification on the screen, the number 14 miles sitting there like a fact that had been waiting patiently for me to find it. What I remember most clearly is that I wasn't surprised in the way I expected to be. The surprise wasn't the fact of it. The surprise was how long I had been looking the other way without knowing I was doing it. That's the thing about consequences. They don't announce themselves ahead of time. They accumulate quietly in the background while you're doing the ordinary work of living. Every choice a person makes adds weight to something, and eventually the structure either holds or it doesn't, and the only variable is whether you built it to account for that possibility. I spent 25 years building things to last. The firm, the house, the agreements I signed because I understood that sentiment is not a load-bearing material. And somewhere in that same period, the person I had built all of it alongside was making a different set of choices, not because I failed to show up. I showed up. I made the reservation. I called ahead about the wine. I showed up every time it was required, and most of the times it wasn't. What I couldn't do was make someone value what they had decided, on their own, and for their own reasons, not to value anymore. That's a hard thing to accept. Not because it's complicated, but because it's simple. Some losses are not the result of a failure on your part. Sometimes you do everything correctly, and the outcome is still the outcome. What I know now, sitting on the other side of it, is that the choices I made in those weeks after I found the notification were the only ones I had real control over. I could have made noise. I could have confronted her the night she walked in from her fake conference, all false ease and careful composure. I could have demanded an explanation, made the damage visible immediately, turned the whole thing into a scene. There would have been a kind of satisfaction in that, the kind that burns fast and leaves you with nothing. Instead, I went to sleep. And in the morning, I called Warren. Not because I was calculating, because I understood, in the same bone-deep way I understand structural load paths, that a person who has planned for failure is not destroyed by it. The prenuptial agreement wasn't a trap. It wasn't distrust dressed up as paperwork. It was the act of a man who took the relationship seriously enough to protect it with something more durable than hope. She called it unnecessary when she signed it. I called it responsible. 14 years later, one of us was right. Donovan asked me once if I was angry. Not in the early weeks, but later, After the decree had come through and we were sitting at a bar table somewhere in South End talking about ordinary things, I told him the truth, which was that the anger had been there and had settled, the way things settle when you stop feeding them. What replaced it wasn't peace exactly. It was something more like clarity. The particular quiet that comes when you stop carrying weight that was never yours to carry. Warren told me once that the most expensive mistake a person can make is to be the one who didn't plan for failure. He meant it as legal advice. I've come to understand it as something broader than that. Planning for failure isn't pessimism. It's the acknowledgement that the people we love are human, that structures weaken, that the only thing any of us can actually control is the quality of what we build and the decisions we make when it comes apart. You build with integrity. You hold the line when it matters, and when someone else's choices bring the whole thing down anyway, you sort through what's still standing, you keep what's sound, and you build again. That's the whole of it, really. 52 years old, firm, solid, kid, good, house mine, enough to build from.